Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Hi everyone, and welcome to On the House, the Household Management Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Gabriella Yastra, coming to you from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's begin.
Welcome back to On the House, the Household Management Science Insights podcast. As housing prices soar and living costs continue to rise, finding ways to make ends meet can feel like a daunting task, irrespective of whether you're a homeowner or a renter. Fortunately, we have a special guest with us today who will guide us through some ways in which we can stretch our household budgets, especially in high-cost housing markets. Last year, he published an article on the conversation about taking transport time and costs into account in the housing affordability debate. So we're very fortunate to be joined by none other than Neil Sipe, honorary professor of planning at the University of Queensland. Hi, Neil. It's great to have you on the show. How are you going today?
Hi, going fine.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And in your professional opinion, what would you say is the biggest challenge currently for homeowners in high-cost housing markets?
Well, obviously not fully accounting for how much money is needed, whether you're a renter or a buyer. So it's basically not enough money or to enter into the market.
Yeah, now that's a great introduction to our topic for today. But before we get further into detail, we like to get to know you better. This is Have You Met Neil? My first question for you is, what do you like to do in your spare time?
My spare time, well, I'm semi-retired. I guess I still involved in some university activities and some research. The other bit is I like to refinish furniture. I like to do picture framing in my spare time. And when I'm not here, I tend to take some time off and travel. So headed to the U.S. in a month or so for an extended stay. So those are some of the things that I do to stay out of trouble.
That's fascinating. Refurbishing furniture has always piqued my interest, but it seems like it takes a lot of time. How much time would you say you spent on that?
Well, I mean, it depends on the piece of furniture. I mean, if you're basically have an antique piece of furniture, you're trying to get the old finish off so you can put new finish on. You know, if you have something that has nice straight lines and not a lot of curly cues and twists and turns, it's pretty easy. But if you have something that has a lot of, it's kind of a lot of different aspects to it that are not straight lines, it's harder to sand, harder to get that stuff off. And it does take a considerable amount of time to do that.
Yeah.
But having said that, it's my father was actually, when he did a lot of things, but later in his life, he was into furniture refinishing. And so I kind of watched him do it. And my mother was involved as well. So I kind of, experience and learning from people that have done it for a while makes it somewhat easier.
Yeah. How long have you been doing this for?
Oh, I don't know, 10, 15 years, off and on, but not as a full-time endeavor.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any favorite pieces from this endeavor of yours?
Well, I'm sitting at one of them, which is a roll-top desk, which I didn't completely refinish, but it's partially refinished. And I think the other thing that I like about old furniture is trying to understand the story of the furniture. So this desk beside me, I bought about 5 Ks from my house, but it was manufactured in Buffalo, New York. and was transported here early in the 20s or 30s to Toowoomba, and then found its way. Uh, it was a farming family. The kids inherited it, moved it here. It was in a garage, and then I bought it, and I've spent some time refinishing aspects of it, but it still needs a lot more work done to it.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love looking at antique furniture and really old furniture as well. I feel like it gives you a window into the world of the past as well. So thank you so much for sharing that. Now, with your framing endeavor that you mentioned previously, what does that entail?
What it I decided that it costs a lot of money to go get something framed. I don't know if you've gone to the frame shop lately, but it's between the frame, the mat, the glass, it can get quite costly. And so I started bit by bit. I started to get a device that allows me to cut the mat, which makes one aspect pretty easy, and then I moved into actually making frames. So I actually have taken some old pieces of furniture that are not needed anymore, like drawers from a dresser, and I've taken the front of the drawers and made picture frames out of those the drawers.
Yeah, I can yeah, I can definitely relate to the framing being expensive bit. Even I always find that thrifting frames are so much more affordable than getting a whole new frame. And oftentimes I will find like a really nice art piece in the op shop where it's not really the art that I want, but it's the framing that I want, which then I feel then guilty about because I have no idea what to do with the art piece because I generally just want the framing. So has that been your experience as well?
Well, yeah, and I guess given the theme of the show, if you're in a household and you want to save money, the clear way to save money on picture framing is going to op shops and and antique places, because a lot of them they'll have picture frames stacked in the corner that have no art in them. So, and you can buy them for a fraction of the cost that it would take to go to a frame shop. And the glass alone, just for a normal size uh, frame, uh, say A4 frame or A5 maybe, you'd pay $20 to $25 just for the glass. So looking at these in op shops is a real cost savings uh, opportunity.
Yeah. Well, it's been great learning a bit more about your side interests. I feel like they're so fascinating and gives me some ideas of what I can do in the future. I've always wanted to refurbish my own furniture, but I have to wait for getting a bigger place because an apartment is just not really feasible for refurbishing furniture at all. Now, the next thing I wanted to ask you is actually if you had any role models either in your professional life or your personal life.
Well, I guess the one person that stands out is a professor that I had in graduate school that was an economist, and so he was. I guess if I had a role model, he was kind of it. He was,
Hmm.
uh, if I think back on my undergraduate and postgraduate education, his course probably, even though it frightened me at the time, uh, he we became friends, and I actually ended up working for him and became friends for quite a time afterwards. So,
Oh, that's such a heartwarming story. What traits of his did you find admirable?
well, he was kind of a no nonsense kind of guy. Um, he unfortunately he had polio, so he wasn't in a wheelchair, but he did use crutches to get around, but that didn't kind of stop him. He was had a lot of energy, swam every day, trying to strengthen his body from the effects of the polio over time. But he had a very interesting career. Was involved in I don't know if you ever saw the movie Chinatown. Uh, it's about um, Jack Nicholson was in it. It won a number of Academy Awards back in the maybe 70s, 80s, maybe 70s. It was about water, uh, availability of water in Los Angeles. So that's what it was. And the Chinatown was Los Angeles, Chinatown. And so my professor was intimately involved, not in the movie, but in water pricing and water use in Southern California. And,
Yeah.
and certainly water availability of water is viewed by a lot of people as we're not going to run out of energy, but we might run out of water. So,
Mhm.
and then I I caught up with them when he was in Florida, and Florida uh, also has water problems, but a little different than Los Angeles.
Well, it certainly sounds worth looking up to. So it's great that you had that role model that you could admire as someone who is going through university. I know that as someone who went through undergrad and postgrad myself, I know how important it is to have a professor like that to be able to look up to. Now, is there a course that you've taken in your lifetime that has inspired you or stuck with you through this date?
Hmm. Oh, probably. I'm not sure that I have any driving uh, cause that I guess I'm interested in a number of different aspects. Certainly, animals and protection of animals and supporting the RSPCA is pretty important to me. I had two dogs, but they both passed within a short time of one another, and I kind of miss them. But I have a real affection for animals, and feel that there's a lot about animals that we don't really know. I think they're more than just pets. I think that's my view.
Yeah. Tell us a bit more about your opinion.
My opinion
Oh,
about
yeah, your view about animals being just a bit more than
uh,
than pets.
oh well, no, I just think that they I think they have a lot of they can sense emotions, and they can. I think that I mean the reason people have emotional support animals, and a lot of people think that's a joke just so that they can take them or animals aren't allowed. But I really view that just from my own experience, and I was only a dog owner for about 20 years, so it's not like I grew up with one, but I found that they're able to sense emotions and sense when you're sick and when they need to spend time just laying beside you and providing comfort. Uh,
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. I have a cat myself, and I feel like he's really he's his behaviors are very frustrating in the sense of he's very raccoon like, but the moment he can sense that I am in distress or in particular sadness, he will stop all of the raccoon behavior and start cuddling up to me, which I feel like is an exceptional indicator of how good animals are at sensing your emotions. So definitely agree with you on that. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's been a pleasure to get to know you a bit better. Now we move on to the interview section. And the first question I like to ask is, how would you define household management?
well, I guess it certainly depends on your perspective. For mine, the management is really on the economic and financial side of things, but clearly household management involves lots of other aspects, cleaning, maintenance, all those kind of things of making sure that things run smoothly within the household. So, um, yeah, uh, that's kind of my view on that.
No, yeah, it's good to bring that up because I feel like most people view household management more on the cleaning and the maintenance side, but not so much the economical or financial side. So it's always good to talk about this and consider all of these aspects and factors. Now, in housing affordability in high cost urban areas, what are some strategies for maximizing the housing affordability?
Well, I think there certainly is an aspect of making sure that you can afford what you're looking at. And I think that a house, whether you're buying a house or renting a place, there's an emotional aspect to that, and certainly in selling a house or buying it, that emotion is a pretty strong factor, and oftentimes people lose sight of the finances and are opting to go with their emotions, and I think that certainly causes some problems in people getting in, having spent more money than they probably could or should.
Mm-hmm. And how much should people be spending on housing? What does it mean to afford housing?
Well, I mean, the accepted principle, and it's what banks have used when they're looking at whether they're going to give you a loan. It's basically you shouldn't be spending anything more than a third of your income on housing. If you're spending more than that, you're the banks and loan folks view that you're getting into dangerous territory. Now,
Mm-hmm.
clearly, that's been the case for decades, but I would suggest that now, if you look at and read the statistics in Australia, I mean, we're talking 40% or more that people are spending for housing, and it's really, I don't think that that's sustainable in the long run.
Mm-hmm. And apart from this, what are some other common budgeting mistakes that people make?
Well, the other thing is that uh, they don't include the transportation cost, and that's generally either the second or third largest household expense. It goes back and forth between transport and food, but people and the research that I've done show that people tend to move away from the CBD as you get outside of the core of the capital cities or any city in Australia. The housing gets cheaper. So, the further out you go, the cheaper it is. And so there's this strong desire to own a home. It's driven into us by the media and advertising and all that stuff, is that you need to be a homeowner. And so people have that inbuilt desire to own a home. They end up buying a place that they think they can afford, but they didn't factor in how much it was going to cost to get to their job or get, kids if they have them to school and do those kind of things. And so those outer suburban areas are not well suited in terms of public transport. And even if they're not using public transport, it probably means that you're going to have at least one car, if not two, to do everything that you need to do. So when you factor in the transport cost with the mortgage cost, a lot of people realize that they're in some serious financial trouble.
Right. And it also, when comparing renting in an urban area or somewhere close to the CBD where you're able to take the train or the tram in Melbourne's case, or the bus even, to get to and from wherever you need to go pretty easily versus getting a house that's further out where you definitely need to have a car and maintain that car. What are some of the costs that people, the smaller costs that people fail to take into account?
You mean other than transport?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's all the things involved in basic stuff like house insurance, which you're kind of, if there's a mortgage holder, they want to know that your house is insured against fire, theft, all those kind of things. You have local government rates, so you got to be paying those. You also have to do routine maintenance, and sometimes that, depending on whether you bought if you bought an older place, there are often maintenance issues that people don't factor in, like maybe they need a new roof or the drainage is not working right. They need to do that, and all those things are, some are more expensive than others. But if you're in an area where you're watching every dollar, the last thing you want to know is that the leak in your basement is caused by improper drainage, and it's going to cost you $15,000 to redo the drainage system so that you don't get a wet basement or wet first floor.
All right. And with all of that in mind, what do you think households should prioritize in terms of expenses to accommodate the high housing costs without sacrificing their quality of life?
Well, I guess if I have one message is that they need to think carefully about the transport costs, and if you could have a household and you could eliminate so you only have one car rather than two, the Bureau statistics, they're suggesting that a cost of a car on average is a little under $10,000 a year. So having one less car means that you have a lot more money in your pocket. And I don't think people realize how much it costs not only to buy a car, but to operate it, pay the insurance, fuel, all those kind of things. And this doesn't include the time involved in sitting in traffic or just the commute. Even if you're not sitting in traffic, it's still, there's a time cost as well. So that's my view. The one way that you can kind of balance your cost is to understand what your big cost items are, and so transport's one of those. Food is another one, and I guess then understanding, how the structure, that if you're buying a house, whether it's in good shape, it doesn't need any work done to it, and so you can kind of withstand, spending a little more than you have to own a home.
And what advice do you have for negotiating rent or mortgage terms to alleviate that financial strain?
Well, I think right now it's kind of a seller's market, and that's, with the prices continuing to increase both for rents and purchase. I would go back to what I said previously. You need to make sure that you're making this on not emotion, that you know what your budget is. You don't get talked into buying something or renting something that you know that you can't afford. And look, if I were a seller, I would want to be selling something for, as much as I can get. But as a buyer, you might have money to make it through for a little bit, but, in the long term, you may not. And that we're assuming that interest rates are going to stay stable or decline. And that's probably not a bad assumption in the short term, but longer term, that may not be the case.
And are there any long-term strategies that households can implement to adapt to the fluctuating housing costs in this environment?
Uh, well, I think I mean, the one thing, and we're seeing this happening now, is that people, their discretionary income that they don't have to devote to food, housing, and transport, they're spending less on entertainment, maybe less on eating out, less on travel, so that's how people are kind of managing this, because as I said previously, people have this strong desire to own a home. And so in this environment, owning a home means sacrificing on these other areas. And I think you can kind of see that if you look around, cities, the businesses that used to be there maybe are not surviving or doing as well as they used to. And we keep continually see, even regarded restaurants and cafes closing because they don't have the business to survive. And I think part of that is because people are not spending money having coffee out. They're doing it in their house or apartment.
Yeah. Yeah, and on a broader scale, what do you think policymakers or politicians can do to support residents in their housing market? Is there anything for them to do?
Well, look, I think there's been lots of people out there talking about, well, how to fix the housing problem. I think the current housing problem has a lot of aspects to it. There's no one solution, and you know, but government needs to play a role. And I think what's happened over the past 2 to 3, maybe 4 decades is that government has gradually deferred to the private sector to providing the housing. So, the private sector is private because they're a for-profit entity. Now, back in the 70s, before a lot of people were born, Gough Whitlam was the prime minister, and he established or wanted states to develop land development authorities. And so these still exist in a number of states, which is basically, rather than a private sector providing new housing estates, the government actually does it. And so it's not social housing or low income housing. It's just basically housing where they can sell it cheaper because the government doesn't need to make a profit. They can, as long as they cover their cost. And so these land development authorities exist, but they're not being used to the fullest extent. So an example would be in Sydney, Landcom is the name of their land development authority. They've provided about 200, maybe 100,000 housing units over the last 20 years. But in the same time, Sydney grew by 2 million. So clearly it's a drop in the bucket. But I think the important point is that those land development authorities are there. They can do it. They just need to be ramped up so that they can do more of this, because the reason for them being established in the first place was exactly this. In the 70s, there was also a housing crisis, very expensive housing, and this was the Commonwealth's solution to the problem. So I think we need to invigorate these land development authorities so that the government can actually provide, more affordable housing in well-serviced locations in terms of transport and other social services.
Yeah, and what can we do in order to invigorate these land development authorities?
Well, I think people, first of all, people need to know that they exist, which I think a lot of people don't. I think the second is the reason they haven't been in doing all that they could is because I think there's a delicate balance that, government doesn't want to be moving into the private sector space of providing housing or seeing that they're a threat. And so I think that, but I think right now that's way out of balance. I think that these authorities could provide a lot more housing than they're currently providing. So how do we make that happen? Well, I think people there's an education role that people need to know that these things exist, and then basically, starting to talk about this and, using social media and other things to get the word out. To me, that it's the same issue as how do we get people to understand that transport cost is a pretty important aspect of when they purchase a house. I think a lot of people they don't realize it until it's too late. But if they had thought about it at the beginning, but they don't.
Yeah. Are there any communities at the moment that do talk about this where our listeners can go to a Facebook group, for example, and spread the words? Or is there a movement that maybe perhaps you think of spearheading yourself?
Well, look, unfortunately, the examples that I have are not Australian examples, but there are, in terms of the forward-thinking planning communities, Vancouver is one of those in British Columbia. They actually, when they have their regional plan, and the regional plan does not look at housing separate from transport. It actually looks at housing and transport together. So people looking at that plan can see that, gee, rather than going 20 Ks from the CBD and spending this money on transport, I can live closer to Vancouver, pay more for housing, but less for transport. And so people need to be aware that there are these trade-offs to be made. In the U.S., there's a Center for Neighborhood Technology. They actually have a platform. It's a GIS site. You can go onto their website and you can pick where you're thinking about buying a house, and it'll tell you what the cost of housing and transport are for the area that you're looking at. So that's updated on a regular basis. It's a nonprofit. They're not making any money on this deal. They're just trying to get people thinking about housing and transport together.
Yeah, that's amazing, actually. And it just reminded me of something where, well, I live in the inner city in Melbourne, and um, I don't have a car, but there are plenty of these car rental companies that where they kind of have these rental cars parked on the streets, and you kind of just go into an app and you rent it for the day. And that in itself, while it might be more expensive than owning your own car, it doesn't mean that you will never be able to drive again, or you can't use a car to get to the market if you need to, if that makes sense. So moving into the inner city and relying on public transport doesn't necessarily mean that you can't ever use a car for your groceries, for example. So that's another thing that I think people might overlook. Now, with what you said about the government and getting them to play a role in housing, even if we do start to get them more involved, how long would it take for them to build more housing?
Oh, well, look, it's not going to happen, for the scale of the problem that we have. I mean, if they had to start from scratch, that would be one thing. They have the structure to do it, and they could start to turn out a lot more houses than they're doing now. But I mean, we're not talking 10 years down the road. They could start to have houses, in the next year or two. But they have to see that they're a solution, one of the solutions to the problem. I don't think we're going to get out of the expensive housing market anytime soon, because it took a while for us to get where we are. And I think one of the problems that, well, maybe Australia faces is that nobody's ever experienced a housing downturn. It's always been, well, even though I can't afford this house, I know it's going to be worth, 10% more next year than it was this year. And to some extent, the government at all levels is trying to make sure that the housing market stays strong. It's too strong. And if the people that live here can't afford, if young people can't afford to live here, then your quality of life declines dramatically.
Yeah.
And I think you have to understand that Australia is a bit unique in that regard. If in the U.S., where I came from previously, the housing market is on its own. The government does very little to support the housing market, and it goes up and down. That can be, expensive housing, and then those houses are worth half the price in a couple of years. We don't know what that's like here. I do, because I've lived in the U.S., but here the assumption is the housing's always going to be worth more in the future than it was today, and that's kind of a unique thing, I think, in the Australian context.
Hmm. That's interesting. And do you think that actually rings true in reality?
Well, look, you have to ask yourself, can housing continue to go up at the rate that it's going up? I just, it's hard for me to think about that. I mean, when I grew up, my parents built a house when I was about 10 years old, and I remember it cost $18,000. So, which at that point it was heaps of money. Now, in Australia, it's like, most metropolitan areas, houses are worth, and most things are worth over $1 million. And it's like, if you move forward another 20 years, what, houses are all going to be worth $10 million in the future? I don't see the wages and the salaries keeping up with that. It just doesn't seem to be realistic. But it could get pretty ugly if there was a downturn in the market, because then people owe more on their house than it's worth. And that's a really bad situation that hopefully we won't get there.
Yeah, fingers crossed for sure. As I am more or less in that age where probably in the next 20 years or so, I'd be looking at buying a house, and I'm frightened. I'm mortified. I'm mortified, Neil.
Right.
So in the meantime, to cope with the housing affordability crisis, what advice do you have for families, homeowners, and residents?
Well, look, contrary to what I just said, I think the important thing is to understand when to get into the market. If you're looking to buy a house, how do you decide when to do that? And I've had my own. I have one daughter that lives here. I have friends with children that are looking to buy a house, and it's always this, the view, well, maybe I'll save money and then I'll have more money for a down payment in a couple of years. Well, that doesn't work, because you can't save enough money to counter the increase in prices. Like in Brisbane, they're suggesting that houses are going to go up by another 10 to 12% next year. It's like nobody can save that much money. And at some point, you have to try to see if you can get into the market and be able to afford that. And so some people they know that, well, interest rates might go up, and how much leeway do I have and how much I make, and is this something that makes any sense at all? I think sitting back and doing nothing is probably not a way to get into the housing market. And the problem is that that's for purchasing. If you're a renter, then it's another matter altogether, on whether you can afford the rents, and the rents are going up at the same rate that the housing market is. It's not a good situation. And I really do believe that, government needs to get more serious about this, because it is a crisis. I don't think it's anything that's made up, and it's not a media kind of driven thing. This is a problem. I mean, all you need to do is look at tent cities that exist and our capital cities. They didn't 10 years ago. People would have been appalled at that.
Yeah, and what advice do you have for identifying when a good time is to enter the market?
Well, I think that, first of all, and nobody can predict this, but you need to have a sense for what you think is going to happen with mortgage interest rates. So it appears as though they're stable, but just last week or 2 weeks ago, they were thinking that they might raise rates again, which would be a big problem. So I think you have to try to get a sense for whether you think the mortgage rates are going to stay stable, so that you at least have an idea of what your costs are going to be. When I bought my first house, interest rates were 17.5%, which is so I know how high they can go. I mean, granted, that was in the U.S., but they were high in Australia as well. So, I don't have a crystal ball, but you kind of need to have a crystal ball to try to have a sense for what you think. I think two things. One, the interest rates are important. I think the rate of increase in housing is important, which neither of those anybody has control over. And the third is, how much money you have to buy the house. in terms of down payment, and can you make the mortgage payments,
Hmm.
and all the other expenses that are involved.
Yeah. Uh, we understand that you don't have a crystal ball, but are there any resources or books or anything at all that we can draw upon that can inform at least our decisions or our crystal ball like predictions in this matter?
But look, I think the first thing is that I think people need to they need to understand the transport and housing aspect, and I think I'm not sure how that's done, because I've written some papers on it, but it doesn't. That's not what the people that are out there buying houses are reading. I mean, there needs to be more of a discussion, and maybe with social media is the way to kind of get people thinking about this. But oftentimes, people don't think about it until they've already made the decision and they realize that they made a mistake. I think there's an education role, and that's kind of what that Center for Neighborhood Technology in the U.S. is about. I mean, it's a free resource; anybody can do it. They're trying to promote it so that people have a basic understanding of at least one of the major costs of housing, other than the price of the house.
Yeah. Um, Thank you so much for answering all of that. I feel like I learned a lot more about this topic, and I'm not going to lie, I feel probably even more daunted now than before thinking about everything else. But it does prepare us a little bit more for the future of the housing affordability crisis. So I really appreciate you coming on here to talk about that with us today. Now we're moving on to the practices and habits section. That's where we talk a bit more about the everyday application of what you've just shared with us. And my main question for you is, what is a habit you'd recommend practicing to manage our housing costs?
Well, I think people need to do a budget. They need to have a household budget. I mean, it doesn't mean that you have to stick, carefully to it, but you at least need to do the budget. And I think a lot of people are probably afraid to do a household budget because they know that it's that they got more expenses than they have money coming in. But I think it's critical, and I think anybody that there's all these companies that that'll do your budget for you if you're in over your head. But I think you need to have a basic sense of managing the house. The whole topic of this discussion is household management, and I think the very core of that is having a budget. You need to know what you have to work with, and I think it's true that you can save money, and you can also spend a lot of money if you're not mindful. I mean, the one book that I think is probably, it's not one of those things, how to maintain a household budget, but it's a book called The Psychology of Money, and I would recommend that for people to read, because it's a good understanding of some of the psychological aspects of money and budgeting that people don't really think about.
Mhm. And how often do you recommend budgeting?
Well, I think you need to. I think you need to do it on a regular basis. I mean, you need to have, just like a government do. You have an annual budget, and then you need to revisit it, monthly, or, I mean, you may do it weekly, but it's probably not necessary. But it should be something that you look at monthly to see whether are you sticking to your budget, are you falling behind, are you kind of, or are you gaining some? And I think only by doing that, you need to have the positive reinforcement that, yes, by not buying 3 coffees, at a cafe, that, if you look at that over weeks and months, it actually starts to be something that is important.
Hmm. And what are some of the main challenges that people face when trying to budget monthly?
Uh, well, I think a lot of people probably don't do it or won't do it because they don't want to they don't want to face reality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's the main. It's a
Yeah.
psychological one. It's like people don't do it because they don't want to see how bad off they are.
That feels scarily true in this housing climate that we're in. I recently saw an article about how Gen Zers or younger people struggling with rent and low wages are looking to little luxuries like coffees and unable to put them down, mostly because we are just so daunted by what is going on in the world at the moment. Even without the coffees, we won't be able to save up for a down payment on a house. And having that little coffee, at the very least, brightens up our very doomsday-ish day. So, what advice do you have for overcoming that, if you have any at all?
Well, I think you need to understand that does exist. That there is and that sometimes our spending habits and that psychology of money talks about that. The book that I was mentioning, it talks about how sometimes these habits are ingrained in us, and we don't even realize that we're doing things until we step back and think about it. So I don't have any great answers other than I think that people need to be aware, because I know friends that they seem like they make good salaries, but they never have any money. And you go, well, what do you do with your money? Well, and that's not like they're extravagant. It's just that they don't they're not accounting for things. And I don't think you need to be, particularly forensic about this, but you do need to have, a sense that, and some people have the sense they don't need to do a budget. It works out fine for them. But there are a lot of people that they can't work this out. They don't have a good sense for it. And so they end up, spending a lot of their discretionary money. They spend more than they really should be given the current situation. And I
Right. And
think,
that's
and the flip side of this is that, people are, we talk about the housing prices, but once people are in a house, then all they want to do is see that price of the house go up and up and up. And so, it's a, it's a wicked kind of problem.
Yeah. Thank you so much for answering my questions and bringing me through some of the everyday practices that we should be practicing in order to cope with the housing affordability crisis. Really appreciate it. Now I move on to the open mic section. This is your chance to talk about anything that you're passionate about that doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor is yours, Neil. Take it away.
Yeah. Well, look, I think the one thing that I do, I used to, as you in my introduction stated, that I used to teach planning at the University of Queensland, and so my concern is that you would think that planners, are involved in land use and trying to make livable communities, we would be actually teaching housing courses. There were no housing courses taught at any Australian university planning school. Uh, I compare that to the U.S., where even at the postgraduate level, you probably have at least one, if not two, courses that focus on housing markets, housing affordability, all the range of housing issues. That's what planners are supposed to be doing. In Australia, they don't seem to have a role in housing. You never even hear of a planner discussing anything related to the housing crisis because it's basically been deferred to housing departments within government agencies, and the housing departments, over the last couple of decades they're basically doing social housing. They're not focused on the big picture housing, and that's I have a real concern with that. I don't see that that's going to change any, but it is one of those contributing factor to contributing factors to why we have a housing problem now, because we don't really view it as a holistic kind of endeavor within the planning field, and that's what planners should actually be doing.
Mhm. Yeah, could you tell me more about the role of a planner in the housing crisis or the housing landscape?
Well, I mean, at the very basic bit, planners are involved in doing either regional plans at a larger scale or municipal plans, city plans. And part of that is to understand, okay, how much growth are we expecting to have in the next 5 or 10 years? And, even though people, a lot of discussion about immigration and all, population growth, I mean, those numbers are fairly stable. They've been stable over the last number of decades. So a city knows how many more people they're going to have in 10 years than they do now. And so the goal is, well, where are those people going to live? Do we have enough houses? Do we have enough apartments? Is there land zoned for that to happen? And so that's how planners, I mean, they are doing things related to housing, but they're not specifically focused on some of what the main core issues are with housing affordability and finance and those kind of things. And that's how planners should be interacting with the system. And I think that most local government planning departments know that that maybe they don't have enough land allocated to provide the housing that's needed for the population growth. And that, to me, that's a failure of government, not only of the planners, but the planners make recommendations to the elected officials. At the end of the day, it's the elected officials that make the decisions. So, you need to have good advice. Whether the elected officials take the advice is another matter.
That's really interesting. So, what do you hope to see in the future of town planning?
Well, look, one of the things, and I was just in a discussion yesterday, a lot of people view town planners as people that tick boxes when a development application comes in for a new project, that they have the regulations and they go through and see whether the project meets those the standards that are set by the local council. So that's one thing that planners do. But I think that my view is that another aspect of what planners do is looking at land use and population and all those kind of things, which I just spoke about. There's a concern, and I think it's a realistic one, that AI is going to put a lot of planners that do development assessment out of work, because basically we won't need a human being. The developer will bring his application in, it'll go in, AI will do the checking and approve or disapprove the project, which means that then the role of the planner is actually looking at the bigger picture issues, not assessing individual projects, but actually looking at the bigger picture and climate change and housing affordability and crime and all the things that I think planners should be doing.
Mm-hmm. And as someone who taught planning, sorry, I need some time to think about my question, because I wanted to ask something about, do you think AI can really take over those responsibilities of a planner? Or
Yes.
if that's a okay.
No,
Okay.
that's a good question. And I don't think there's no doubt that that's going to become, planners sitting in offices assessing development projects will probably be, in 10 years, there may be a few people do that are supervising and making sure that the decisions comport with the regulations, but there are going to be a lot fewer people doing it.
All right. Yeah.
I mean, to not get in too much detail, but Australia's planning system really is just a carbon copy of what they do in the UK and England, which means that almost everything that you want to do, if you're a homeowner, if you want to put out a new front porch or a deck in the back, all those things are supposed to get planning approval, which means that there's a lot of demand for planners to be checking all those things. So it's all the way from very small projects to big projects. In the U.S., in contrast, those things like front porches and decks and those things, they're approved by the building department. There are people that basically have no tertiary qualifications. They have a high school education. They're the ones that are making those decisions. So you don't need a 3-year degree or a post-grad degree to be making those decisions. So to me, I think it's a waste of resources that we have college-educated folks doing the development assessment phase when it could be done by somebody with far less education, or in this case, we don't need to make that decision because AI will take care of that. I have no doubt. And there's been a lot of research that is suggesting that this is not a far-fetched thing. It's not like we're talking about autonomous vehicles, which have been promised for not quite a decade, but I think AI is a serious threat to planners that are involved in development assessment.
All right. Thank you for shedding some light on that. And thank you for joining us today, Neil. If our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
University of Queensland website, and I'm also on LinkedIn. Those are the main areas that I engage with.
Amazing. We'll link those to the show notes. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
You've been listening to On the House, produced by the Household Management Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes like this from across 10 life management perspectives can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your smart devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at hm.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Gabriella Yastra. Thanks for tuning in.